I speak today not as a man who claims perfection, not as someone who believes power belongs to him by right, but as a servant burdened with responsibility, standing before history, conscience, and ultimately before Allah. Leadership is not a throne to sit upon. It is a weight that presses on the soul every moment you are awake, and even when you sleep. When I reflect on leadership, I do not look first to modern theories or polished speeches. I look to history, specifically Islamic history, because within it lies a standard so high that it humbles anyone who truly understands it. Islam did not teach leadership as domination. It taught leadership as Amanah, a trust, one that will be questioned on the day when no army, no title, and no applause will matter. When I read about the leaders who shaped Islamic civilization, I do not see men obsessed with power. I see men afraid of injustice. I see leaders who trembled at the thought of being unjust to even one soul. This is not weakness. This is strength refined by accountability. Islam teaches that authority is not ownership, it is stewardship. You do not own the people you govern. You are responsible for them. Their hunger, their fear, their dignity, these are not abstract ideas, they are debts written against your name. In Islamic history, leadership begins with intention. Before strategy, before governance, before armies or institutions, there is niyyah. Why do you lead? Who do you serve? If the answer is ego, history eventually exposes you. But if the answer is service to Allah and justice for people, then even your mistakes become lessons rather than crimes. This is why Islamic leadership has always emphasized character before command. You cannot command hearts if your own heart is corrupted. One of the most powerful lessons I draw from Islamic history is that leaders were not elevated above the law. They were bound by it. The ruler and the ruled stood equal before divine accountability. This principle alone reshapes everything. It means leadership is not protection from consequences, it is exposure to greater consequences. The higher you stand, the more visible your actions are, and the heavier their impact becomes. Islamic leadership was never about silencing criticism. It welcomed correction. Leaders were advised publicly, questioned openly, and held accountable without fear. This culture of accountability did not weaken societies, it strengthened them. When leaders allow truth to reach them, even when it is uncomfortable, they protect the future of their people. When they surround themselves only with praise, they begin to decay from within. I reflect deeply on how Islamic leaders understood justice. Justice was not selective. It was not shaped by tribe, wealth, or influence. Justice was a sacred obligation. Leaders were taught that a single act of injustice could erase years of worship if it involved the oppression of others. This understanding produces humility. It forces leaders to listen more than they speak, to think before they act, and to measure decisions not by popularity, but by fairness. Another profound lesson from Islamic history is simplicity. Leadership was not accompanied by excess. Leaders did not separate themselves from the people through luxury. They lived among them, walked their streets, and felt their struggles firsthand. This closeness created empathy, and empathy created justice. A leader who cannot feel the pain of the people will eventually become their burden. Islamic leadership also teaches courage, but not reckless courage. Moral courage. The courage to say no when corruption invites you. The courage to stand alone when truth is unpopular. The courage to choose long-term justice over short-term stability. History remembers leaders not for how comfortable they made the powerful, but for how faithfully they protected the weak. I often think about how Islamic leaders viewed wealth and resources. They understood that public wealth was sacred. Misusing it was not clever governance, it was betrayal. Every coin taken unjustly was a witness against them. This mindset transforms how decisions are made. It makes transparency natural, not forced. It turns leadership into guardianship rather than exploitation. Islamic history also teaches patience in leadership. Real change does not happen overnight. Leaders were taught to endure criticism, to face hardship, and to remain firm without becoming cruel. Patience did not mean passivity. It meant discipline. Discipline of the ego, discipline of emotion, discipline of power. Without patience, authority becomes tyranny. One of the most striking lessons is how Islamic leadership understood victory. Victory was not merely military success or political dominance. Victory was maintaining justice when power was greatest. Many can be humble when weak, few can remain just when strong. Islamic history praises leaders who feared Allah more when they gained power, not less. Leadership in Islam was inseparable from moral responsibility. Decisions were not justified by outcomes alone. The means mattered. You could not achieve good through injustice. You could not build stability on oppression. This ethical framework protected societies from collapsing into moral chaos, even during times of expansion and conflict. As I reflect on these lessons, I ask myself difficult questions. Am I listening enough? Am I correcting myself quickly enough? Am I surrounding myself with truth or comfort? These questions are not signs of doubt. They are signs of responsibility. A leader who never questions himself is already dangerous. Islamic history reminds us that leadership is temporary. Power passes. Titles fade. Only deeds remain. Leaders who understood this ruled with restraint. They did not cling desperately to authority because they knew it was never truly theirs. This understanding freed them from fear and arrogance. Another lesson that resonates deeply with me is the emphasis on unity without erasing diversity. Islamic leadership respected differences while maintaining shared principles. It did not force uniformity of thought, but it demanded justice in coexistence. This balance prevented fragmentation without suppressing identity. Leadership in Islam also recognizes that knowledge is essential. Leaders were students before they were commanders. They sought wisdom constantly, understanding that ignorance in leadership multiplies harm. A leader who stops learning begins leading blindly. I reflect on how Islamic leaders treated the vulnerable, orphans, the poor, the oppressed. These were not side concerns, they were central measures of leadership success. Societies were judged not by the strength of their armies, but by how they protected those with no power. There is also a profound emphasis on sincerity. Actions done for display were empty. Leadership was not a performance. It was an obligation carried quietly, often painfully. This sincerity gave leaders moral authority that no propaganda could manufacture. As I stand inspired by these lessons, I do not claim to embody them perfectly. I claim only that they represent the standard we must strive toward. Islamic history does not give us legends to worship. It gives us examples to learn from. It warns us of failure as much as it celebrates success. Leadership is a test. Every decision is a page written in history and a line written in the unseen read. Islamic leadership teaches us to rule as if every action will be read back to us when excuses no longer exist. And so I continue to reflect, to learn, to correct, and to remind myself that leadership is not about being remembered, it is about being accountable. Because leadership, as taught by Islam and proven by its history, is not a destination you arrive at, it is a path you walk every single day, often in silence, often misunderstood, often alone. When I look deeper into Islamic history, I realize that the greatest leaders were not those who spoke the loudest, but those who listened the most, to their conscience, to their people, and to the commands of Allah. They understood that authority without humility becomes oppression, and humility without action becomes weakness. True leadership balanced both. In Islamic history, leaders did not separate spirituality from governance. Faith was not confined to mosques. It shaped decisions, laws, and behavior. This integration created leaders who feared moral failure more than political defeat. They understood that winning the world while losing the soul was the greatest loss. This perspective changes how power is exercised. It restrains cruelty. It disciplines ambition. It forces leaders to ask, not only can I do this, but should I do this? I reflect deeply on how Islamic leaders viewed accountability. They did not wait for rebellion or collapse to correct themselves. Self-accountability came first. They held themselves responsible before others did. This inner discipline is what protected societies from decay. When leaders correct themselves early, nations do not have to suffer to force correction later. Islamic leadership also teaches restraint in anger. Leaders faced insults, criticism, and even betrayal, yet they were taught not to govern through emotion. Anger clouds judgment. Islam teaches leaders to pause, reflect, and respond with justice, not revenge. This discipline preserved social harmony even in times of tension. Another powerful lesson is consultation, shura. Islamic leaders did not govern alone. They sought advice, welcomed differing opinions, and understood that wisdom is not monopolized by authority. Consultation was not a sign of weakness. It was a safeguard against error. Leaders who listen expand their vision. Leaders who isolate themselves shrink it. When I study Islamic history, I see leaders who understood the danger of arrogance. Arrogance blinds. It convinces leaders that they are irreplaceable, infallible, entitled. Islam shattered this illusion. It reminded leaders that they are servants, not masters. The moment a leader believes he is above the people, he has already failed them. Islamic leadership also emphasized fairness in judgment. Decisions were not based on personal loyalty or hatred. Justice was blind to status. This created trust. When people trust their leaders, societies become resilient. When trust is broken, no amount of force can restore stability. One of the most striking lessons from Islamic history is how leaders prepared for death. They governed, knowing they would one day answer for every decision. This awareness softened hearts and sharpened ethics. Lead. Ours who remember death rule differently than those who believe power makes them immortal. Islam also taught leaders to avoid extravagance. Excess was seen as a distraction from responsibility. Leaders lived simply so that people could live with dignity. This simplicity protected leaders from detachment and corruption. It kept them grounded in reality. As I reflect, I realize that Islamic leadership does not promise ease, it promises meaning. Leaders were tested with hardship, resistance, and sacrifice. But through these trials, societies were shaped by values rather than fear. Islamic history also teaches that silence in the face of injustice is betrayal. Leaders were expected to speak against oppression, even when it was risky. Moral courage was not optional. It was the essence of leadership. I think deeply about how Islamic leaders treated opposition. They did not erase dissent through brutality. They addressed grievances, corrected wrongs, and distinguished between disagreement and rebellion. This wisdom prevented endless cycles of violence. Leadership in Islam also demanded consistency. Leaders were expected to live by the same standards they enforced. Hypocrisy destroyed credibility. Integrity built authority. This consistency created leaders people could follow without coercion. Another lesson that shapes my reflection is mercy. Strength without mercy becomes cruelty. Mercy without strength becomes vulnerability. Islamic leadership balanced both. Leaders were firm when justice required firmness and gentle when compassion could heal. Islamic history reminds us that nations rise and fall based on justice, not wealth. Power without ethics collapses. Ethics without power struggles. Leadership must unite both under moral guidance. As I continue to reflect, I recognize that leadership inspired by Islamic history is not about replicating the past blindly. It is about applying timeless principles to present realities. Justice, accountability, humility, consultation, and service are not outdated values. They are eternal necessities. I do not claim that leadership is easy. I claim that leadership guided by Islamic principles is purposeful. It demands self-control, sacrifice, and constant reflection. It demands that leaders see themselves not as saviors, but as servants entrusted with fragile human lives. Islamic history teaches us that true success is leaving behind a society more just than the one you inherited. It teaches that leadership is not measured by monuments built, but by suffering reduced, not by speeches delivered, but by trust preserved. And as I continue this journey of reflection, I remind myself that leadership is not about how history will remember me, but about how Allah will judge my intentions and actions. That awareness alone is enough to keep a leader awake at night, questioning, correcting, and striving to do better. Because when a leader truly understands that judgment does not end with history books but continues beyond this world, his priorities change. Power no longer intoxicates him, it disciplines him. Islamic history shows U.S. leaders who feared the consequences of neglect more than the consequences of confrontation. They understood that delaying justice for convenience only multiplies injustice later. This awareness created leaders who acted decisively but not recklessly, firmly but not cruelly. One of the most important reflections I draw from Islamic leadership is the concept of responsibility extending beyond borders of time. A decision made today can echo for generations. Islamic leaders were conscious of this ripple effect. They did not govern for applause in their lifetime, they governed for stability after their death. This long vision protected societies from short-sighted ambition. Islamic history also teaches leaders to protect dignity before enforcing order. Human dignity was not negotiable. Even punishment was regulated to prevent humiliation and abuse. This restraint did not weaken authority, it legitimized it. When people feel respected, they obey willingly. When they feel humiliated, obedience turns into resentment. Another lesson that weighs heavily on my reflection is how Islamic leaders treated trust. Trust was sacred. Betraying trust, whether public funds, promises, or responsibilities, was considered a moral collapse. Leaders guarded trust carefully because they understood that once broken, it is almost impossible to fully restore. I also reflect on the role of patience during reform. Islamic leaders knew that correcting deep-rooted problems requires endurance. They did not abandon principles under pressure, nor did they impose change without wisdom. They balanced urgency with wisdom, firmness with understanding. Islamic leadership did not confuse dominance with strength. Strength was defined by control over the self before control over others. Leaders who mastered their impulses mastered their authority. Those who failed to control themselves eventually lost control over their people. History also shows us that Islamic leaders did not rule through fear alone. Fear may create silence, but it does not create loyalty. Loyalty was built through justice, consistency, and care. This loyalty protected societies during crises.